Is it working? Okay, good. Hi, everybody. I don't know how the video quality is going to be tonight. Is it super choppy or is it all right? Okay, looks like it's working. Okay. It's very choppy. Okay, let me see if I can fix that. Okay, I'm not sure what I can really do about the video quality. I guess everybody can hear me though. Okay. Well, the Wi-Fi is just terrible tonight, so I don't know what I can really do, but I'm going to start taking questions, and hopefully it'll improve. This is actually the last night of lockdown in France, so I wonder if that has anything to do with it. Okay, so I have a bunch of questions already. Let's see. So the Vivchav writes, "Hi Samuel, I'm a big fan and current music student at Cambridge University. I have a couple of questions for you. Could you share the names of some obscure and maybe forgotten composers from the 20th and 21st centuries who you think have been particularly interesting, innovative in some way?" Yeah, well, the 21st century, it might be a little bit early to try to do that, but as far as the 20th century goes, there's certainly many composers that have been forgotten for one reason or another, that might be totally unjust. I think Wallingford Rieger is one, an American composer who I really like. The problem with this question, though, is that there are very few composers that are really obscure in the sense that nobody knows anything about them. I mean, information is just so easy to come across now that it's hard to think of a name that really nobody has heard of. But there are certainly people who I think should be played more often. I think everybody I like should be played more often, actually. Some other names that I might be able to think of spontaneously. Well, I really like Christophe Bertrand, who's a French composer who maybe not a lot of you would have heard of. Christophe Bertrand was actually from Strasbourg, where I live. I met him on one occasion, and unfortunately he passed away very young, about, I can't remember how many years ago, maybe about 8 years ago. He's a remarkable figure. A lot of people actually felt that he would be the next great hope French music, actually, until he passed away at a very early age. So if you hear that name, check him out, Christophe Bertrand. He's got a portrait CD out, and there's actually plans for another disc or another series of discs covering his work. His music is really interesting because he wrote this sort of incredibly virtuosic music that's quite hypnotic, actually, in terms of just the extreme speed of a lot of the figurations, a lot of the rhythms, and just the really vivid colors. Really an incredibly creative and original figure, I would say. And then, would you be able to come and give a talk at the university in the near future, assuming that the world goes back to some sort of normal? I really enjoy giving talks at universities, and I would be happy to do that. You can just get in touch with me via email if you want to set that up. And Julius Seizure writes, "Hi Samuel, I was wondering if you have any plans to do a video on Alfred Schnittke." I've thought about it, actually. The only thing there is I'm not terribly familiar with vast swaths of his output. I mean, that's a composer that wrote quite a lot of music, and I would actually have to really spend a bit more time on his, listening to his work and engaging with it before I would feel totally qualified to do that. But yeah, I mean, he's an important figure for sure, and I think that it's important to engage with Schnittke, and I will do so at some point. Let's see, what else do we have here? I was wondering, this is from Colin Tadish, I was wondering, although you vaguely illuminated it in one of your videos, how do you go about composing? Is it simply intuitive, or do you have systems that determine pitch, rhythm, etc.? I don't have systems. I have good working habits. Yeah, I'm aware of certain principles of writing that I don't think have really changed all that much in the past 600 years or so. As far as systems go, the term has a certain degree of stigma attached to it because it sort of implies that you're sort of delegating a certain amount of the creative act to something that is just sort of automatically put into place and that you don't have to think about. And the reality of composition is quite a lot more complex than that. So I wouldn't really describe anything I do in terms of a system. I wouldn't describe it in terms of attempting to piece together any kind of a theory either. It really starts with the need for a certain type of expression, like an expressive project, and then I invent the tool that I need in order to express what it is that I need to express. And actually, the artists that I really like and respect tended to work that way. So an example I often give is Yves Tanguy, the French painter, who was a self-taught painter, and he had a particular vision that he wanted to express. It's a very odd and singular vision. And instead of, let's say, learning a range of conventional, traditional painting techniques, and then using that as a kind of method for expressing his vision, he instead invented the techniques that he needed in order to express specifically what it is that he had in mind. So in other words, he started with the why, and then he worried about the how afterwards. So that's another way of looking at it. So what else do we have here? Julius Seizure, Boulet's student, right? I guess you're referring to Christophe Bertrand. No, he wasn't a student of Boulet's. Boulet's didn't actually teach composition. Well, he did briefly in Basel, in the 1960s. Actually, Heinz Holliger was one of his students, but I think he only taught in Basel for 2 years. And the rest of his career, he basically didn't teach. He often said that he was a very bad teacher. So no, not a Boulez student. I think, I can't actually remember. I think he studied in Strasbourg and then also in Germany. But yes, Christophe Bertrand. So Charlie Charlatan writes, "Hi Samuel, I've been writing music lately and I've often wondered, is there a point where music becomes too complex and there are too many distinct factors that it becomes unlistenable?" It's hard to answer a question like that because it really depends on the work. And it's not as though the degree of complexity of a piece of music is fixed once and for all either. I mean, a piece can start out relatively simply and then make gradually increasing demands on your cognitive capacity and then become comparatively simple again. Actually, a lot of Beethoven pieces work that way, or they work the opposite way. So the level of complexity in a piece is in itself a dynamic parameter of the work, right? It can change. And there's a form of expressivity that comes with sort of pushing that a little bit too far sometimes. In other words, like deliberately writing music that is just it has a little bit too much information to be apprehended properly by the listener, by their perception. But that, I think, is really only satisfying when it's, again, embedded within a very dynamic process of gradual simplification or complexification of the music. If it's just like that all the time, then my tendency is that my thought is that it tends to get boring, and you might not want to watch it for very long. Let's see. What is your opinion of Harry Partch? Personally, I love his music and dedication. Yes, well, Harry Partch is great. He's great. There are surprisingly few figures like that in music history, these sort of real, genuine, independent outsider types. And most of them seem to have been Americans. I mean, it's actually a kind of a subcategory of American composers that I find immensely attractive, and that you don't see a lot of, not in the same way in European music. The Harry Partches, the Carl Ruggles, Charles Ives, obviously, Henry Cowell, people like that, who are sort of resolutely independent and sort of attempting to forge their own vision without borrowing very much from other composers, or without necessarily having a conscious attitude towards musical history. So yes, Harry Partch is great. Yeah, like going as far as inventing your own instruments, your own system of temperament, doing everything yourself. It's remarkable. Very few people have the fortitude, I would say, to do something like that. Stockhausen was another one, although it manifests in a very different sense with him. So you've talked about a handful of carefully selected pop music artists. Could you elaborate on what it is that arouses your interest in certain pop music? Well, it's not all that different from what arouses my interest in any kind of music, really. There's no fundamental difference. I suppose one important criteria is that I have to be able to listen to something more than once without getting bored. A lot of pop music doesn't have that. It's like you hear it once and you've kind of absorbed everything there is in it. And actually, worse than that is you've heard 10 seconds of it and you can kind of extrapolate what the rest is going to be like. That's the sort of thing I'm not very interested in listening to. But if something is really quite rich and sonically compelling, then I'll be the first to want to listen to it, regardless of the genre, and I really don't care what it is. So, I mean, one thing that you see in a lot of pop music, I would say, is a kind of extraordinary ingenuity with regards to sound, mixing, orchestration, arranging, using, bringing in all sorts of unusual sound sources and putting them into completely improbable combinations. I find that really quite appealing. So there you go. So Kevin Chen writes, I recall a tweet from you that works from the classic canon, such as the Moonlight Sonata, should be performed as if they were fresh new works. Can you elaborate on what that means to you? Yeah, I think the tweet was actually that new works should be played as though they were established classics. And old established works should be played as though they were world premieres. And that's something that I would really like to see happen. What I meant by that was, actually, there is a kind of entirely artificial division, I would say, between the way contemporary music works, the world of contemporary music, if you like, and the world of classical music. And really, since the post-war era, these two streams, if you like, have become more and more separate. And I think that's extremely unfortunate, because they're not actually separate. They're continuities of each other. So what I don't like is the sort of the idea of putting contemporary music in a separate category and rehearsing it differently, performing it differently for a specialized audience, and so on. What I would really like to see is an integration of very contemporary music, in other words, pieces that were written very recently, and things that are older, and see if you can bring them into some kind of an actual resonance where the pieces seem to talk to each other and inform each other in an interesting way. And also, in terms of older repertoire, I would say that there are a lot of ingrained habits in performers where, if you're learning to play a Beethoven sonata, you don't simply just play the notes and the rhythms on the page. Nobody does that. You actually, what you're doing is you're enacting an entire tradition of performance when you play these pieces. Like there are certain received ideas about rubato, for example, that become almost completely automatic habits. Nobody even thinks about them. It's like if you're playing Chopin or Liszt or something, like a nocturne by Chopin, almost everybody's going to do the rubato in a very similar way. And I'm not sure that that's always in the service of the music. And I love people who come and just give you a fresh look or a different perspective on it. Even if that perspective doesn't end up working, it's much more interesting and dynamic and creative, I would say, to take those kinds of risks. The emblematic figure, as far as I'm concerned, is Glenn Gould, as far as that goes, because that's what he always did. He never recorded a piece unless he had something fresh and different to say about it. You know, if you're doing yet another Beethoven cycle, there's really no excuse for doing that, I think, unless you really do have something quite new and fresh to say about those pieces. So, why are Canadian composers like Murray Schafer and Claude Vivier never mentioned in the media? Well, Canadians are never mentioned in the media generally, with very rare exceptions. Look, depends on what media you're talking about. Murray Schafer and Claude Vivier are actually very well known in France. They're quite well known in Germany as well. They're known in a number of European countries, the UK as well. I mean, look at the question a different way. How many contemporary composers from the Czech Republic can you name? You know, it's the same in a lot of countries. How many contemporary Swiss composers can you name if you're not from Switzerland? So I don't think that there is a particular issue with Canadian composers not being represented properly. Okay, thoughts on George Crumb? Yeah, I really like George Crumb. He's wonderful. I actually met him briefly in Toronto. New Music Concerts was doing a portrait of George Crumb's music, and I got to go to a talk he gave, and I really liked what he had to say. I love his music. Let's see, there's quite a few questions here. Old established pieces should not be played at all. Well, that's one point of view. That was actually Stockhausen's point of view. He felt that old music had far too much of a place in the repertoire and in the programs of orchestras, and that the ratio of, let's say, established pieces to new creations should be radically revised. I don't actually agree with that point of view, but there you have it. What do you think about Olga Neuwirth? I don't know her music all that well. I've heard a few pieces. So, yeah, I probably shouldn't comment because I've really only heard 2 or 3 things. Okay, so Samuel Dvorin writes, Hi, Samuel. As an incoming composition student in the fall, what do you think is the best way to spend the extreme time I have in quarantine? Listening, writing, analyzing, etc. Well, it partly depends on the country, because there are countries where the restrictions are much more severe than others. I would say that if you are able to, getting outside is really important. I know that in Italy and in Spain that was not possible for months. It might still not be possible in Spain. I'm not sure. I think they're starting to open up there. In France, the restrictions were quite severe, but we at least had the possibility of going out for 1 hour a day to get some exercise. And I think if you don't do that, it's much worse than if you stay at home 24/7 all the time without getting out at all. So if you can manage to get out, that will probably keep you sane and healthy. Obviously, taking precautions. Besides that, listening, writing, etc., etc. Yeah, all of those things, definitely. I would say, if it's too difficult to write a big piece right now, for whatever reason, write short pieces. Maybe you could imagine what you might be able to write in a day, for example. What could you write in 2 hours? And maybe you could imagine writing a series of really tiny etudes, like little 10-bar pieces or something, each of which is quite different from the previous. Those are the sorts of exercises that I think can be extremely interesting in unusual circumstances like this. There are poets who do things like that, where they write a poem every day for a year, and then they sort of edit it and collapse it down, and then you end up with a kind of an interesting book at the end. And there are painters also. There's Robert Motherwell, who I really like, American abstract expressionist painter, did a series called the Lyric Suite, reference to Alban Berg, in which he did these paintings on Japanese paper, and there are these just really fast gestural paintings that he would have done in a few seconds. You have to, actually, because on Japanese paper there's so much bleed. You can't really, it's really thin, fragile paper. You just have to make a couple of gestures very quickly, or else you'll destroy the paper. So there are many examples of artists working under constraints where they try to do something within a particular temporal frame. And one thing I've heard from a lot of people is they're having trouble concentrating during confinement for various reasons. It's very stressful. It's a massive disruption. So you might want to focus on things that are not too taxing for your concentration, but that still give you a sense of forward momentum. So how can a piece have meaning if it doesn't have words? Well, that's the mystery of music, actually. It's sort of like pure meaning. It's sort of like a form of meaning that goes far beyond words. I suppose you might say it like that. When I'm listening to a really profound piece of music, or a piece that is extraordinarily involving and intense and transcendental, it's like an encounter with undiluted meaning. And that's a very powerful thing. Words are limited, very limited. They're easy to misinterpret. They only go so far. Whereas music is incredibly profound medium at times. So is there a name for the current period in music, post-50s, 60s Surrealism? No, there isn't a name for the current period in music. It's hard to name things that are in the process of being born. So God knows what it'll be called in 20 years. I have no idea. But look, you can't boil it down to a single style or school. That's the first thing. I mean, that's immediately obvious, because there are just so many parallel tendencies going on in composition at the moment that, this idea of imagining music history as a sort of a series of discrete eras. It's like the Baroque era ends and then classicism begins, and then the classical style comes to an end, and then the romantic style is born, and then et cetera, with this sort of series of sort of one era after another. I think that especially since the post-war era, what you actually do have is a series of concurrent developments, some of which happen simultaneously. So others, will sort of come on the scene very quickly, and then very immediately just sort of immediately fizzle out. And none of these, I think, you could really point to as being particularly dominant. maybe in a particular country or context, they might be dominant for a while, but it's, you can't point to the entire era and say this is the era of this. And I think that as we move forward in time, I think that's going to get harder and harder, and just a completely irrelevant way, frankly, of thinking of music history. So, any tips for getting commissions more frequently and reaching a larger audience? I've been writing a lot of chamber music for that reason, but even then it is still difficult. Well, I would say consider carefully your reasons for wanting a larger audience in the first place. Like, having a large audience is a consequence, it's not a goal. It's a consequence of writing pieces that are not only compelling, but they're sort of immediately compelling. In other words, and in addition to that, they sort of fit a particular contemporary need. And some of that you have a little bit of control over, but a lot of it you actually don't, and a lot of it is actually also luck. So I think that you have to be the right person in the right time, and if you are that person, you also have to work incredibly hard and recognize an opportunity when you see it. That's another thing, actually. It sounds like an obvious comment. A lot of people don't recognize an opportunity even when it's staring them in the face, or they'll see it, but they'll be distracted, or there'll be too many other things going on, and they won't take it. So having a talent for recognizing opportunities, I would say, is also important. So, what are some ways in which a composer can affect one's perception of time? What are some examples of pieces that seem to move faster or slower to an extreme degree? Well, Messiaen was pretty good at that. But, musical time isn't the same as chronometric time. Like, if you imagine a piece by, I don't know, some of the Beethoven bagatelles, for example, are incredibly short. There's one that's about 10 bars long. It goes by in a few seconds. The business of listening to these pieces properly and interpreting them and imagining them and having them affect you doesn't really so much go on when you're in the process of listening to them in a recital hall or a concert hall or whatever it might be. It actually happens afterwards, I think, when it becomes part of the furniture of your mind, so to speak. And it's very interesting when that happens, because then you can imagine something like the Beethoven Fifth Symphony or whatever work you might want to imagine as being a thing that you can contemplate. And you're not sort of stuck in imagining it in a straight line from beginning to end, but you can imagine it in a sort of all at one kind of flash, if that makes any sense, and imagine it as an object of contemplation. And that's where musical time gets really strange, because the piece might objectively be 20 minutes long or 3 minutes long or whatever it might be, but you don't necessarily experience it that way. That's a very roundabout answer to your question, but hopefully not a completely useless one. Let's see. Can you recommend a book about music theory, especially harmony, in English, French, or German? I would love a follow-up on your favorite music books. Greetings from Berlin. Aha. Also Grüße aus Elsass. A book about music theory. Well, I really like the Schoenberg Harmonielehre. I think that's a fascinating book. I don't necessarily recommend it to students, just because, there's a lot in there that is really idiosyncratic. It's fascinating, of course, and brilliant, but for an undergraduate, for example, who just wants to learn the basics of harmony, there's probably a more expedient way to do it. But that's a great book. And the thing I love about it is he's not taking anything for granted. This is the first principles idea applied to music theory, where he'll take something as apparently banal as a C major chord and spend 10 pages talking about it. And it's really, really interesting. And I think that's how one should think about harmony, not as a set of rules and not as a set of conventions, but rather as something living that you investigate and you sort of imagine what you can do with it, and come to a sort of a personal understanding of that. So, yeah, definitely the Schoenberg harmony book is very good. So, can you really write a relevant symphony in 2020 without reflecting contemporary styles like pop, electronic, jazz, etc.? Sure, absolutely. symphony doesn't really mean anything. It's sort of a genre, but it's sort of not a genre. Like if you look at the symphonies written in the 20th century by people like Lutoslawski, Weber, and Chris Dench. Who else wrote symphonies? Henri Dutilleux. These pieces have very little in common. Like they're not actually. It doesn't really mean all that much as a term. I think a lot of people just take a symphony to mean a grand statement with comparatively large forces, but beyond that, I think it would actually be really fun to write a symphony. I've often imagined that I should do that myself. So, what are your favorite novels? Well, I actually have trouble with novels. I have trouble reading novels. The novels that I seem to enjoy the most are kind of not really conventional novels. So, for example, I love Joyce. I love James Joyce. I love Finnegan's Wake. Yeah, Ulysses. I love reading Georges Perec also. Georges Perec is the French novelist who wrote La Disparition, which is a novel written without the letter E. Fascinating book, and he did it. And the book has actually been translated into English also without using the letter E. So that's an interesting one. I like those sorts of things. I like conceptual poetry also, I think is extremely fun. I like 20th century poetry. Novels have never really been my thing. I find them impossible to concentrate on, and actually they kind of boring most of the time, I have to admit. But that's my limitation. We all have our limitations. So, favorite viola piece. Oh, well, Hindemith wrote beautifully for viola. Obviously, he was a virtuoso violist. His Opus 25 Viola Sonata is a really important piece in the context of the early 20th century. A lot of the early Hindemith pieces, I would say, I really like quite a lot. Then there's also a prologue by Gérard Griset. This is a huge viola solo that starts his six-part piece, Les Espaces Acoustiques. If you guys don't know that piece, that's certainly one of the major statements of the last 50 years or so. Les Espaces Acoustiques by Gérard Griset, French composer, and one of the sort of leading lights of spectralism. And that's a great work. Do you prefer to use the human voice as just another instrument? No, absolutely not. It's not just another instrument. The human voice is very distinct from instruments. It can't do the same things. And there's also obviously the question of meaning and how do you place the vowels and how do you place the consonants and breathing and all sorts of things. So no, you can't really do that. There are composers, certainly 20th century composers, who have more or less treated the voice as though it were on the same level as an instrument. So, well, Webern certainly in some of his mid-period vocal works, Opus 18, which I've analyzed on my channel, for example, is a good example of that. The vocal parts in that are ridiculous. Actually, they're almost unsingable. And he writes for the voice basically in the same way that he writes for the clarinet or for the guitar or whatever instrument, in the sense that there's all these disjunctive leaps and it covers about 3 octaves. And yeah, it's a very, very odd work. I love it. I absolutely love it, but I wouldn't write that way myself necessarily. I have a quick question. Can you guys actually see me properly, or is it just a frozen screen? Because I think the video quality is not so good. Not that I can really do much about it. I'm just curious. Frozen. Okay, I'm going to try something here. Let me see if I can change camera and if that actually does anything. That doesn't work. Okay, too bad. Yeah, we'll just stick with the audio for now, and I don't know, maybe I'll put this out as a podcast. This is fun anyway. So, Is free improvisation like free jazz contrary to serialism, or is it a different method for a similar goal? Yeah, oh yeah, it's very, very different for sure. It's extremely different. First of all, free improvisation, in my experience, is never actually free, in the sense that even if the performers state that they have no particular goal in mind when they're starting, or in other words, they literally do not know what they're going to do when they sit on stage. In reality, when you're an improviser, you have a kind of a bank, or a store, if you like, of gestures, a sort of physical, tactile, muscle memory type gestures that are there at your fingertips. And a lot of the time what happens in a live improvisation is a sort of a spontaneous recombination of things that are already stored in your memory. So obviously, yes, it's a reactive process. You don't know exactly what you're going to do, but it isn't as though you were just born 5 seconds ago and you're just sort of reacting in this very pure way to whatever environment you're in. It's not really like that. So, and as far as serialism goes, I mean, yeah, it's music that is I think it's actually impossible to improvise a serial piece, or a piece using some kind of a dodecaphonic or a serial technique. They're actually not the same thing, simply because the basic materials are so complex. They're really complex, actually, that I just don't think you could do it. And you wouldn't necessarily want to anyway, because one of the things about serial music generally is it compresses a huge amount of information into quite a small space. So it exists in a temporality that just is completely at odds with the idea of improvisation. Okay. Will you produce any analysis videos of living composers like Thomas Adès or Wolfgang Riem? Adès I would like to do. Yeah, I really like him. Wolfgang Riem, yeah, I like his music, but he's not someone that I would prioritize in terms of doing an analysis video necessarily. Yeah, doing analyses of living composers is a somewhat tricky proposition for me, for the simple reason that I know so many of them personally. And it's actually difficult to have the requisite distance when that's the case. What I do like to do is invite living composers onto my podcast, and I have been doing that with increasing frequency. If you guys actually don't know, I do have a podcast that you can listen to on iTunes and Buzzsprout, Apple Music, like all the major streaming platforms. And there's a lot of content that is only available on the podcast, and I interview performers, composers, and other people that I think it's interesting to interview. Recently, I did an interview with Nick Storing, who's a Toronto composer who I really like. So check that out, the Samuel Andreyev podcast. You can find that easily, and there's also links on my YouTube page. Charles Warrenen was exclusively serial, wasn't he? Well, I don't know if he was exclusively serial. I wouldn't make that claim, but he was certainly extremely identified with that approach. Serialism isn't actually, by the way, it's not proper to call it a style. There's no serial style, in the sense that you can write serial music and have it sound like jazz, or you can have it sound like all kinds of things. So the stylistic question is really independently of how the piece is actually put together, in terms of the just the way the notes are structured. I'm not even sure it's fair to refer to serialism as a technique either. It's more like a loose assemblage of techniques, some of which are shared amongst certain composers, and others of which are actually extremely idiosyncratic and individual. So it really depends. Are compositional schools useful? When do they become a pastiche of themselves? I don't know about compositional schools per se. I think that when a composer is reflecting a particular culture, let's say, or a particular cultural moment, then it's inevitable that there's going to be some degree of commonality of spirit between them and other people who are also embedded in that same culture. The idea of sort of consciously banding together and saying, we are a group of composers that are about this or that, I think that it's more of a pragmatic thing, really, than something that has a great deal of bearing on the art itself. It's it's probably easier to market yourself if you're associated with a particular school or particular approach to composition. That's the main thing I would say. I don't know that it's always useful beyond that. And a lot of composers have gotten stuck with a label, whether it's Surrealism or Spectralism or whatever. I find that very often they resent it later, or they are very unhappy that that they've been reduced to this simple one-word sort of label. So yeah, people who don't have a label are sort of frustrated that their work is impossible to market, and people who do have one are frustrated that that's what they invariably get reduced down to. So nobody's happy. When you are starting a piece, do you prefer to compose the music purely on paper or try out ideas at the piano? I don't try out ideas on the piano. I write at a desk. I write at this desk, and I have to qualify that somewhat, because if you're writing things according to, let's say, a known procedure, where you know the grammar, so to speak, you know the materials, you know the types of harmonies and so on, you know the rhythms. If you've integrated those things properly, you don't really need a piano, because you know how they work and you can kind of handle them. It's like if you were to write a sonata in the style of Mozart, I don't know that a piano would necessarily be terribly helpful. But on the other hand, if you were to do something where you were starting to develop a new harmonic language, or particular combinations of chords, let's say, or a particular melodic style that you haven't done before, I think that a piano is actually useful and probably even necessary in those instances, because there are aspects of harmony that I think if you don't have some physical contact with the medium, it's going to be very difficult to work with them properly. So there's a difference between, if you're working with a known thing, like imagine you're using a chord that you've already used 40 times. It's like, you know what it is, you know how it works. Then it's not necessary to do that. So, have you heard Horatio Radulescu? Yes, I have, actually. I agree that he's underrated. That's somebody that I would like to look at some point. Let's see, what else? Are there any early modern composers you believe are unjustly neglected that deserve rehabilitation? Max Reger, Ernst Krenek, etc. Well, Krenek, this is going to sound a bit catty. I'm not sure he is unjustly neglected. First of all, his music is actually performed. A lot of it is recorded, and he's not an obscure figure. Johnny Spielt Auf is done fairly regularly, his big opera. He wrote a lot of music. It's not all of the same level of quality. Some of it's very good. I was listening just the other day, actually, to 12 pieces for piano in a serial style by Krenek, and they're beautiful pieces. They're gorgeous pieces. Those would be great pieces to show to students who are sort of coming to terms with dodecaphonic music for the first time. But unfortunately, they're not really known all that much. But that's partly a consequence of just writing a lot of music and having a huge catalog. You can't play everything. There's works of Bach that nobody plays, or very, very rarely. So yeah, I wouldn't call him unjustly neglected. It's like if you compare Krenek to someone like Varese, for example. Varese wrote very few pieces, but they're mostly played. There's basically nothing in his catalog that never gets done, and that's just partly because it's such a small catalog. It's very different. So Hindemith is another one. There's all kinds of pieces that you just don't hear very often. Let's see. Do you have a favorite chord? No, I don't have a favorite chord. I'll explain why. A chord for me it's not a thing. Like a chord, it only makes sense musically. It only has any meaning to me musically in terms of what comes before and what comes after. So that's what I would say about that. Like a chord in a particular context it means something very different if you put it in a different context. So a chord that might sound extremely dissonant in Tchaikovsky, for example, will have a completely different meaning in a piece by Schoenberg or whoever, or Janacek. So Stefan Volpe has been recorded lately. It's great. Yeah, I love Stefan Volpe. He's wonderful. Yeah, he's definitely somebody who doesn't get enough attention, I would say, for sure. There's something thrilling about the 4-2 chord. I guess so. Yeah, it's a nice chord. But it's like that. It's like a guy at a bar who's a little bit too persistent. He's like starting to put his arm on you, and it's like it's too much, and it's like it's something too persuasive about it somehow. Like someone who's just they're leaning in a little too close. It's just too much. I'm going to change my camera just a second. Okay, this should be working again, hopefully. Let's see. Okay. I just arrived. Did I miss anything? Well, maybe. Do you know anything about, are you at all interested in any Irish contemporary music or composers? I'm trying to think. I don't actually know any, which is an astonishing admission, come to think of it. So I guess that's something I should do something about. I've never actually been to Ireland. So there you go. As soon as I get the chance, I'd be thrilled to visit. I have many Irish friends, none of them musicians, unfortunately. So, what do you think about Toshio Hosokawa? Yeah, great composer. Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I love his work. Master colorist. Do you think that at a certain point in history, music history, analysis started to influence composition more? No, I don't really think so. No, I think that throughout history, there have been composers who have been, let's say, very involved in theorizing or in writing treatises. In other words, trying to systematize their music or their era to some degree. And there are other composers who simply haven't done that. So Rameau was certainly one in France who attempted to create a coherent, rational system of harmony. But there are many other composers who also didn't do that. And it depends on the composer. Some people are sort of have a more analytic mindset, let's say, and others do not. So I don't think it's a historic thing. I wouldn't necessarily say that there are more of them today than there were 300 years ago. And actually, in terms of 20th century music, there are, well, no, I'll say that a little bit differently. In terms of music being written today, I think you can say actually that there is a generational shift in the sense that there were a lot of composers/theorists in the post-war era, and people like Boulez, Stockhausen, Henri Pousseur, many others, who really were invested in questions of technique and were sort of thinking aloud publicly about such things. The composers of my generation and younger ones do not seem to have that preoccupation at all. You don't see them actually publishing papers about how they go about writing, or theoretical papers or anything like that. There's very, very little of that. Very little polemicizing also. So there seems to have been a move away from that, maybe partly as a reaction against the sort of public perception of post-war music. A lot of post-war music is being excessively intellectual. I don't know how to account for that otherwise. So let's see. Do you construct musical ideas methodically, or do they appear in your head spontaneously? Do you often use outside inspiration or improvisation? They're pretty spontaneous, and that's how I prefer the situation to be generally. If it's sometimes you do need to construct something. In other words, sometimes it can be very helpful. For example, if you're being a bit too boring or a bit too predictable, sometimes using a constraint can be an excellent way of just coming up with something you wouldn't have imagined otherwise. And I think that can be very helpful. But most of the time, yes, it's a reactive process in which I have to be extremely concentrated to do it properly. Jack Doherty follows up here. Sort of what I expected. Irish music isn't too well known, even within Ireland. I'd recommend listening to some Gerald Barry or Donacha Dennehy if you can. I'd be interested in your opinion. Okay, well, I will retain those names. Look, the other thing, there are a few composers that transcend national boundaries, so to speak, and become international phenomena, but a lot of composers don't. And there are countries that haven't exported their musical culture as much, you might say, as others. So, it's like who are all the contemporary Croatian composers, for example? Who are the contemporary Luxembourgish composers? I actually know a few, but you see what I mean. And we talked about Canadian music earlier. It's a kind of a similar issue. And the Canadian composers just aren't terribly well known internationally for the most part, with a few notable exceptions. So, any thoughts on Louie Andreessen? Oh, yeah. I've been listening to Louie Andreessen lately. I've been listening to De Staat, actually, which is this... if you guys don't know about sort of Dutch minimalism, it's very interesting. There is a kind of a European contingent, you might say, of minimalism. It's often actually quite erroneously described as being, primarily an American phenomenon, but there were plenty of European minimalists as well, and particularly in the Netherlands. And Louie Andreessen is one. I find his music actually really quite engaging and very interesting. So De Staat is a really important work from that. That's DE space STAAT. I'm actually going to mention that on a video pretty soon. How do you approach Kurtag's music? Oh, well, with infinite love. He's a great composer. Kurtag is a great composer. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What he can do in a few seconds in terms of intensity and expressivity, and it's amazing. That's how I approach it. And gratitude also, because, someone's compressed their lifetime of exploration, thinking, reflection, ingenuity, creativity, their incredibly profound connection with the music of the past and their personal viewpoint upon it, into these luminous works that everybody can enjoy. That is a tremendous gift. You know, we should all be deeply grateful to these sorts of people. And he's in his 90s now, I think. That is a rare and valuable human being. Could you recommend some contemporary composers for beginners? I've listened to composers like Schoenberg, Webern, or Stockhausen, but I find it difficult to get an overview of music written today. Well, it's difficult for me to get an overview of it, for that matter. It's difficult for everybody. There's just so much of it. And there's all these local schools and things happening in different countries. Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think, try to get to a concert. That's probably my best piece of advice. It's probably best if you can get out to a concert, see what's happening locally, meet some people maybe locally who can tell you what they're listening to. I think trying to methodically understand what's happening all over the place right now is probably just impossible because there's so much of it. Maybe that's defeatist, but someone wrote, in a multicultural West, national music has even less meaning. No, actually, I disagree. There are definitely, as someone who has traveled, there are definitely national characteristics in different countries that you see. They're not necessarily explicit, but there's a kind of, you'll see a community of attitude, at least in France, as opposed to Germany or Switzerland or the UK or other places. They're not the same, and the local scenes are not the same. If you go to a concert in Paris, it's a very different experience from going to one in London or Berlin or wherever. So, no, I don't think so. There has been some degree of leveling out, and there's certainly a greater degree of what would you say, exchange amongst composers. I mean, people travel all the time, and they'll draw in influences from lots of different places, but I still find that hasn't actually completely flattened out national characteristics, despite everything, which is kind of an interesting thing. What is maximalism? Well, I don't know that maximalism is really a thing, but there are composers who define themselves that way. Milton Babbitt called himself a maximalist, actually. And I think what he meant by that was, overloading the senses. Like, how much can you put in the smallest space, really? How much meaning can you pack into a piece of music? How much sort of, what would you say, structurally relevant and unique information in a very, very small space with a minimum of redundancy and repetition. So that's one example. Bill Harkleroad mentioned the Kurtag string quartets, but I can't find them. Seems he did mostly vocal music, Kurtag. Oh no, Kurtag wrote a number of string quartets. There's a disc out on ECM Records of the Keller Quartet, Keller Quartet, playing Kurtag string quartets. And I would unhesitatingly recommend that disc to anybody. It is a magnificent disc. The thing about the Keller Quartet, actually, this is a string quartet that has actually a pretty small repertoire. Like, they're the opposite of the Arditi Quartet. The Arditis will do 100 premieres a year. And there's a huge number of pieces that they'll just play once, and then they'll workshop them one time, and then they won't play them again. The Keller Quartet has focused on a very comparatively small repertoire, but going in incredibly deep. Not to say that the Arditis never go in deep, by the way. It's just a different way of working. And when they play Kurtag, you know that they've been over those pieces with a fine-tooth comb. They've worked on them very, very carefully with the composer. They're magnificent renditions. Have you heard Kurtag's recent opera Fin de Partie? No, I haven't. I've heard sections of it, but I wasn't able to go to the premiere. And I don't particularly enjoy watching operas on DVDs or listening to them. It's the sort of thing where I would much rather be in the hall. It's the nature of the experience. So but I'm extremely curious about it, and I do hope I get a chance to go see it. So, what do you think about the question, what is music? Not what is your answer, but how should this question be approached? And does it even make sense to ask and answer this question? Well, I suppose it makes sense to ask it. You know, it's a complicated phenomenon. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. There are certain things that seem to be constants, though. You know, for me, music is sound charged with meaning, and its vehicle is time. And it tends to be, you know, you can't have music without movement. Like, that's the other thing. Music is fundamentally an art of movement and of time. And yeah, it's hard to improvise a response to this because it's such a complicated question. But it's movement and sound sort of charged with the highest possible degree of meaning, and I think that's what makes a piece of music. Let's see. Theoretical question: if someone had composed a piece by you and you heard it, would you say that's exactly how I would compose, or is the process more important to you more than the result? Well, I think with a lot of creative people, the process is more important than the result. I don't get too attached to the result, and in fact, once a piece is completely finished and it's off my desk, I'm happy to not think about it too much unless it's being performed and I have to rehearse it. But if somebody composed a piece, I would say good luck trying to write something in my style. I don't think that would be terribly easy. Partly because style is a dynamic thing. And it's not just me, it's lots of composers. It changes from work to work to some extent. A lot of the specific materials that you use will be peculiar to a particular work. And you won't necessarily see the same materials being used in the same way across multiple works. So you could maybe do a parody of a particular piece. I don't know that anybody could really imitate my style beyond that. So let's see. In what ways would you predict that our acoustic instruments will change into the future? In what ways would you like them to? Yeah, well, if you extrapolate in terms of what's happened in the last 100 years or so, it doesn't look like they will change very much. And I don't really know what I can say about that. You know, if you compare, let's say, the period from 1800 to 1850, in terms of the development of instruments, to the last 100 years, I mean, it's way slower now. It's like things are completely frozen. The clarinet, the oboe, the flute have hardly changed at all. There have been a few minor changes. You know, maybe a couple of extra trill keys added on woodwind instruments, or that sort of thing. There have probably been some innovations in piano manufacturing, but these are not huge changes. Bösendorfer makes a piano with 4 pedals, and I think they've made a few pianos that descend down lower than the low A, that go down to the low F, things like that. But these are really, you know, yeah, they're not major changes, and they're fairly eccentric ones, and they're ones that actually have a very limited impact on the market as a whole, for the most part. I think that, you know, you would have to accept that the vast majority of innovation in terms of instrument building has been in electronic instruments, not really acoustic ones. And there are reasons for that. You know, it's extremely expensive to develop an instrument, to change it, to bring it to market, to get players to accept it. If you were to suddenly bring out, let's say, an English horn or an oboe with a new improved fingering system, it would be actually probably quite hard to get oboists to accept it. And that actually has happened, but they remain, for the most part, you know, these experimental instruments have a very small market for the most part. So let's see. What do you think about British composers like Mark Anthony Turnage and Thomas Hadess, in addition to Julian Anderson and Harrison Birtwistle? Well, I like all of those figures very much. Thomas Hadess, I mentioned earlier, I certainly admire. I heard his piano concerto recently and was very impressed by that. Let's see. Do you like Robert Wyatt's music? I heard you talk about him briefly in one of your videos. It caught my attention when you mentioned him because Rock Bottom is my favorite rock album. Yeah, I like Robert Wyatt. I might lose a few subscribers by saying this, but I lose patience with some of the later things. Yeah, I bought Sleep when it came out, and I just found it not as thrilling. I have to say, not as engaging. Yeah, but Rock Bottom is a great album. I also really enjoyed The End of an Ear, which is this experimental LP he did before Rock Bottom. I think it was either just when he had quit Soft Machine or just before. Somebody will probably correct me on that. But the early stuff is Ruth is Stranger Than Richard is a great record also. So that's my 20-second Robert Wyatt capsule. Let's see. Is there any piece that you've changed from liking to disliking or vice versa, and why did it happen? That happens all the time. I think most things that I hear for the first time I initially don't like. And why is that? Maybe I'm averse to new things. I don't know. No idea. But over time I've learned that I have to be patient, try things more than once, return to them, postpone any form of judgment as far into the future as possible, and to really give things the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes there are works where I'm afraid that, I just cannot enter that world. It just does nothing for me. That does sometimes happen. Let's see. What are your opinions on the composer Michael Finnessy? He seems to be a very polarizing composer, and even I find some of his works very compelling, while others almost disgust me. If I'm completely honest, I don't feel a strong sense of connection with Finnessy's music. I really like is Chris Dench, who's a British composer who now lives in Australia. He emigrated there a long time ago, over 30 years ago, I think. He's a remarkable composer, not sufficiently well known in my view. He recently wrote a 100-minute long piano sonata that'll just tear your brain to shreds if you can sit through that. It's pretty amazing. But yeah. All of my opinions, by the way, are provisional. You ask me the same question about Finnessy in 3 years, and I'll probably tell you he's fantastic. So, how is Finnessy any different to Fernyhough? Well, he's different in terms of the style, the materials, the attitude, the expressive world, the texture. It's like everything. I don't think they have a lot in common, actually. Which composer do you wish had lived longer? All of them, obviously. Except Saint-Saëns. I feel like he had enough years. I feel like that was a good length of life for Saint-Saëns. If someone were to come up to you and ask for your signature on a score, what would you do? Well, I would check that I was awake and not dreaming, because that it's like a scenario for a science fiction film. It's like so ridiculously improbable. I'm trying to think if that's ever actually happened. I have had people stop me and ask me for my autograph on the street, which is kind of weird, but not on a score. Yeah, it's so improbable that I have no way of sort of imagining what I would do in that circumstance. So, what music did you enjoy before discovering serious music? Or did you enjoy other genres that are more in the commercial or pop category? Huh. Well, I'm going to be completely open here. I have two older sisters, and they were really into 80s pop music. So there was a lot of that in the house. When I was 5 or 6 or 7 years old, it was all Thompson Twins, Culture Club, The Clash, Crass also. I remember they were playing. I'm trying to remember what else. Bow Wow Wow. A lot of stuff like that. Sex Pistols. Yeah. So that's what I was listening to. I enjoyed it. I'm still really into Bow Wow Wow, by the way. If you guys don't know, I'm going to get the name wrong. See Jungle, See Jungle. Yeah, it's this. Yeah, anyway, it's like their big album. It has a really long title. It starts See Jungle by Bow Wow Wow. Yeah, you should listen to that. It's a great record. Verdi, Wagner, and Puccini. Which is your favorite and why? Puccini. Why? He wrote like disgustingly beautiful melodies. It's like that is a once in a century gift. Nobody could write melodies like Puccini. Absolutely gorgeous. And he did it so effortlessly. It's upsetting, actually. So I'll give Bow Wow Wow a try. Well, there you go. There's a convert to Bow Wow Wow. Fantastic. You know, this chat will have been worth it for that one reason. It's not all equally good. The later things are a little bit less thrilling, but they had a moment, you know, for a couple of years there where they were a pretty exciting band. Okay, so you know, I'm gonna stop in about 3 or 4 minutes. So let's see what else we have here. What do you think of Cage? Well, the music I often don't enjoy particularly listening to, but I think Cage was a genius. I think he was an extremely important artist in many respects. I think of him as someone who was a composer, but he was also a writer, an artist, visual artist, a poet. He did a lot of things, and they all sort of tie into his worldview in a very compelling way. And the works themselves, some of them are extremely exciting, others not so much. It's the attitude, it's the life, it's the approach, the intense creativity, the desire to experiment and try new things, in a really thoroughgoing way. I think is very appealing. I really like Cage. Do you think composers are able to make statements/claims about what music should or shouldn't be because of funding? I'm thinking of Babbitt's Who Cares If You Listen, etc. I don't think that's the claim Babbitt was making, actually. And if you read that article, first of all, that wasn't his title, right? There's an amazing amount of damage to Babbitt's career due to the fact that this article, which was actually initially called The Composer as Specialist, was arbitrarily retitled Who Cares If You Listen by the publisher. And he's forever being quoted back as being sort of the composer who wrote that article, who doesn't care about audiences. And it's simply not true. And I don't think he was claiming that certain types of music should receive funding or should not. That's not the claim he was making. He was simply pointing out that that the composer who, let's say, works in isolation and without any thought as to commercial success, and sort of developing their work in a very inward-facing way. Let's say, like it's sort of eschewing any kind of audience input or reaction or any kind of commercial pressure. That is a worthwhile and potentially very valuable attitude to have in the art world. And I agree with that. Not everybody works that way. There are great composers who had an extraordinary commercial sense and had were very good at attracting a large audience, and others that were not able to do that and had to find other ways to get their work out there. In general, I would say if a composer is actually making some kind of a moralistic statement or claim as to what other composers should be writing, then I would be extremely wary of that individual. Have you had a nice day so far? Oh, that's such a nice question. Yes, I have had a nice day. So I've had a very nice day. This is the last day in confinement in France. It's going to be over in an hour and a half. And in an hour and a half, I'll be able to leave my house, go wherever I want, not require a paper, a signed form. Be interesting to see what that looks like tomorrow. Just before I did this live stream, I went on a bike ride. It was really nice. Within a 1 kilometer radius, because that's what I'm allowed to do. But it was still really nice. Do you like Carl Stallings' work for Looney Tunes? Oh my God, I love Carl Stalling. Yeah, I first listened to Carl Stalling when I was maybe 18 and blew my mind. He's one of the great orchestrators of the 20th century. It's amazing, actually. I should qualify that. I don't know that he orchestrated all of his own stuff. He might have just done a short score and then had a guy at Warner Brothers do the orchestrations, but whatever. It's amazing. Carl Stalling's great. I'm going to make a couple of announcements before I do the last questions. There's a few things that I just want to get out there. So one of them is I'm not on Facebook anymore. I don't really like Facebook. I am on Twitter. I think Twitter's amazing. I love Twitter. I'm very active there. So if you guys are interested in following what I'm doing on a more, let's say, immediate level, then Twitter's the place to go. I find it weird, actually, that I have by my standards anyway, I think a pretty good YouTube following, and Twitter has been a little bit slower to get going. But I love Twitter, so follow me on Twitter if you're not already. That's the first announcement. Number 2 is, throughout the confinement period, there's been a dramatic increase in requests for lessons. I do online lessons. I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, and there's been more and more of them. So that's something that I really enjoy doing, actually. And it's a format that seems to work particularly well in composition. It's like I really enjoy working with composers, whatever the age, whatever whatever stage they're at. I've worked with doctoral students. I've worked with confirmed composers who are professionals. I've worked with beginners. I really enjoy doing it, and I enjoy giving personalized lessons. So if that is something that anybody watching this or listening is interested in, get in touch, because it actually is something I'd like to continue to do more of. So there you go. And then the final thing is that if you enjoy my speaking and you want to help keep doing it to some extent, whatever, you can have a look at Patreon. I'm offering all kinds of things in exchange for monthly support on Patreon. So there you go. Because I would like to keep spending more time on the channel. I'm really enjoying it lately. So but I need some support in order to do that. So there you go. Okay, so back to the questions. Glad to hear the confinement's over. Yeah, me too. It's not completely over. They're going to do it in stages, but it's going to be a big change, and I think a lot of people are going to be very curious to see how it plays out. So. Daniel Huang writes, my birthday is today. Well, happy birthday, Daniel. That's great. My question is, what do you think of Benjamin Britten and Michael Tippett? Would you consider doing videos on either or both composers? I'm not sufficiently familiar with Michael Tippett, unfortunately, and that's unpardonable, and I'll be doing something about that. But there you go. Benjamin Britten, I love. Yeah, I really enjoy Benjamin Britten's music. When I was a teenager, my first major exposure to Britten was when I was an usher at the Canadian Opera Company, and they did Billy Budd, and I heard that opera about 10 times, and was really impressed. So yeah, I really like Britten. Let's see. So Benji Guang writes, I just want to say I'm an aspiring composer and I really love looking at your content and how you bring light on contemporary music and how I can develop my understanding as a composer and a listener. Thank you. Well, it's a thrill. I'm really happy to do it. Really happy to do it. What is your pricing for lessons? Send me an email. And yeah, just send me an email. So, okay. I'm going to go, guys. I really enjoyed doing this. I'm sorry about the technical problems. The problem is Strasbourg doesn't have a fiber optic cable. And the connection quality here just is lousy. So I'm not sure what I can really do. Maybe the best solution would be, once confinement is over, I could try doing a live stream in a different city or a different country where there's actually, a better quality of internet. It's the case also in parts of Baden-Württemberg, Germany, just across the border, where the internet quality just is not very good. So it'd be nice to do, a proper live stream with good video quality and all that. But in normal times, I do travel quite a lot, and it would be possible to imagine planning something in a different city. So, how often do you do the Q&As? This is a new thing for me. I did the first one in March. This is number 2. I'm going to see if it might make sense to do them on a monthly basis. We'll see how that goes. So, thanks a lot, everybody. It's been a real pleasure. We'll do it again. And talk to you again.